Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I am the Program Associate at YIVO. Today is Sarah Ellen Zarrow and Jeffrey Chandler joining us for a discussion about the book, Polish Jewish Collecting and Museums, 1891 to 1941. And this book is available in the YIVO store, and we just put a link to that in the chat. I highly recommend that you check it out. So for those of you who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books, when these resources are used by researchers from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. So for today's book talk, we have the author Sarah Ellen Zarrow joining us. She is the Associate Professor of History at Western Washington University. She holds an endowed chair in Jewish history. Her ongoing research focuses on Jewish life in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland. She is especially interested in Jewish museum practices, language politics, and schooling. She previously was a research fellow at New Europe College Institute for Advanced Studies in Bucharest, Romania, and a visiting scholar at the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies at NYU. She holds a doctorate from the joint program of the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and the History Department at NYU. She has also served as a consultant to archival and museum projects at YIVO and Polin, designing exhibits and creating educational programming. We also have Jeffrey Chandler joining us. He is Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers. His publications include Adventures in Yiddish Land, Post-Vernacular Language and Culture, Shtetl, A Vernacular Intellectual History, and Homes of the Past, A Lost Jewish Museum, which we are selling in the YIVO store. Among other titles, he is editor of Awakening Lives, Autobiographies of Jewish Youth in Poland Before the Holocaust, and translator of Emil and Karl, a Holocaust novel for young readers by Yankiv Gladstein. So thank you, Sarah and Jeffrey, for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. And it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to everybody today about Sarah's new book. And Sarah, why don't we just start by having you tell us what prompted your interest in this topic?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here and to be in conversation with you, Jeffrey, as well. So I came into my PhD work with an arts and culture background, a music and dance background. I thought at some point I might want to go into anthropology, do ethnographic fieldwork. But when I was beginning grad school, a number of books had really just recently come out about Ansky's work, especially his team's work, similar subjects. That's kind of where my mind was. But I found myself really interested in I guess what I'd call something one step removed from that process, like the histories of the ways in which people did field work, looked at the results of ethnography, used it themselves in creating museums. And my first really longer archival trip involved stops in Vienna, where there was a great interest in Galicia, in Jewish life in Galicia, and then also in Lviv. And it was really in Lviv that I started to find evidence of Jews using Jewish art, fine art, folk art, Judaica, decorative objects towards this goal of showing how integrated they were into Polish society. And so that's kind of where things began. And if you read the book, you can see there's a lot about the museum in Lviv, and part of that is because that was the beginning of my research and kind of what sparked my interest.
Terrific. So you talk a lot in the book about these projects to create Jewish museums in Lviv and also in Warsaw in particular. But let's back up a little bit, because before there are Jewish museums, there are Jewish collectors collecting ritual objects, folk art, fine art, all various forms of Jewish visual and material culture. So tell us a little about who are the key collectors of this kind of material in Poland. What were they collecting? And I think perhaps most importantly, what was motivating them to do that?
Yeah, this is a great question, and to a certain, there's some variation between collectors, but what I can say is that in general, very often, let's say, collectors were from Jewish families that were termed at the time assimilated. That was a term that others used about them. That was sometimes a term they used themselves. It didn't necessarily have pejorative connotations. I think that that's really important. I find that term less helpful for us today. It really now, I think, connotes Jews with little connection to organized Jewish communities, whether that's a positive or a negative thing. So scholars tend to use the term maybe acculturated, integrated as ways of describing these Jews now, and that's what I would say. They tended to be very integrated. They often came from families with some prestige and wealth, maybe one generation of a greater deal of prestige or wealth, not necessarily stretching back so far. Often their families were connected to both official Jewish communities, also to state or municipal institutions of one type or another. The main collector in Warsaw, whom I look at, Matthias Berson, for example, he came from an observant family that was involved in industry. He himself was in banking. Everybody in his family, his father, also his grandfather, was involved in philanthropy, especially within the Jewish community, but not only. The majority of collectors I look at had interests that also included non-Jewish material. So for example, the main collector I look at in Lviv, Maximilian Goldstein, he was a numismatist. He was interested in coin collecting. He was interested in stamp collecting as well. He had this kind of broad-ranging interest in coins and stamps and other types of material culture, some of which was Jewish, but not all of which. The founder of the Society of Friends of the Jewish Museum in Lviv, who was a doctor, Marek Reichenstein, he was an avid collector of book art, including Jewish books, but again, not limited to it. As for motivation, I think it really varies. I can identify a few things. One is aesthetics and taste, and I'm hesitant to remark on that as much. It feels somewhat sui generis. Why does one person collect stamps and another collects book art and another is drawn to painting? But other than that, most of the collectors that I look at, when they turned their collections public or semi-public, they were interested in objects and sometimes also documents that detailed some aspect of Jewish history vis-a-vis like the state. So Marek Reichenstein, for example, had a collection of ktubas, Italian ones. He seemed to have been particularly interested in these as an example of ritual art produced by a really highly integrated community. And communities, really, they're from different cities. Others had portraits of known figures in the Jewish community. Matthias Berson in Warsaw had an engraving of a unit, a military unit that was formed during the 1830 November uprising that had accepted Jews. Maximilian Goldstein in Lviv, in Lemberg, Lviv in particular, also were interested in naive art or folk art. And that's actually less common. A lot of the collectors are interested in what I would say like artisan Judaica, like very high quality Judaica, portraiture documents or document related, like the rings you could use to seal a document, things like that. But there is also this undercurrent of folk art, which at some point we will also talk about.
Great. So it's a very wide-ranging set of materials that, when you think of all of these collectors collectively, they're sort of implicitly defining Jewish visual culture, but through the act of collecting itself. It's a really very interesting moment to watch this happen. So something I want to pick up on something you mentioned about the kinds of folks who are doing this, who are sometimes referred to as Polonized Jews. That is, as you mentioned, these are members of an educated elite, an economic elite. They speak Polish. They sought and in many cases succeeded in integrating themselves into Polish civic life, but while remaining Jews. These are not people who are abandoning their Jewishness. And you write that they regarded themselves as wholly Jewish and wholly Polish. And that's wholly, W-H-O-L-L-Y, not holy, like sacred. Could you tell us, like, how did they understand this notion of being, let's say, entirely Jewish and entirely Polish? It might be a little clearer. Um,
Mhm.
are they separate but equal, parallel? Are they complementary? Like, how did they understand this relationship?
This is a great question. This is something I thought about really like throughout writing the book. At one point, I say they didn't their identities weren't bifurcated. They didn't consider themselves half-half, and they're not split. So I think complementary is one way to think of it. I think that idea of, I'm really drawn back to like an image of a circle and this idea that somehow people who are identifying with one or more than one culture are sometimes asked to give percentages. And what I would say is that this was a question that would not necessarily have made sense, or their answers would not have made sense. They're 100% Polish and 100% Jewish. And yes, that makes them 200%. I think that neither part of their identity disturbs the other. They're not at odds, or they might be at odds sometimes, but certainly not. They didn't feel themselves to have these identities with odds at odds with each other in their everyday lives, which I think is in contrast. Like I know, for example, in the Yivo autobiographies, which you've illuminated and translated, often youth are writing that they feel there's some tension. I didn't really see that with the collectors that I'm studying. I think, they regarded themselves as Polish patriots, and they didn't see Jewishness as at all opposed to that. For Jews who had more nationalist sentiments, whether those were kind of more diasporist or more Zionist, those could be harder to square. Now I've introduced a square in addition to the circle, but they could be harder to square, not necessarily. This is something I think I consider like a really key takeaway from my research, that Jewish nationalist ideology of whatever stripe didn't necessarily mean a sort of a separatist ideology or a separatist identity, removing oneself from the broader polity. And I think that, I'm obviously not the first person to say that, but it just seemed really, really key. How many people I write about were deeply involved in Zionist organizations and this project of demonstrating Jewish belonging in Poland. And earlier I mentioned assimilation. I think it's also important maybe to underline that there's this line, like assimilationists, there's a line for everybody I write about. They didn't abandon an idea of being Jewish. Berson, for example, there was a question. He had donated quite a lot of art to different institutions in Warsaw, not necessarily Jewish ones, like to the National Museum, to other museums. And there's a little bit of a question, why didn't he leave, especially some of like the family Judaica, why didn't he leave it to his children? And at least one person has postulated that it could be because his children were baptized, his children converted out of Judaism, and whether not passing along his Judaica was kind of punishment for that, or whether it was just practical, like they won't need it, is unclear. But that's really interesting to me. In that case, like his commitment to Jewish community actually outweighs, at least in this one way, a family commitment.
Yeah, so it's very interesting how this business of assimilation is not only is it is sort of a tainted word today in a way that wasn't being used then, but how it was understood in different contexts, whether it was, you've got one foot out the door, or no, this is a way of being, as you put it, entirely in these two worlds at the same time. And what I think would be helpful to talk about is, what do the folks that you look at, how do they see the creation of Jewish museums as the way to demonstrate this in the public sphere? In particular, you talk about two different museums created in very different contexts. In Warsaw, which when this starts, it's in Congress Poland, it's under Russian rule. This is before World War I. And then in Lvov, but it's Lemberg before it's part of the Austrian Empire, then becomes part of Poland. So it's very different contexts. And how in each place does this idea of, what we need to do is create a Jewish museum. Jewish museums are a very new phenomenon at this point anywhere. What do they seek to do, and how does it play out in these different locations?
Yeah, it does seem like there's the idea of the museum seems when it comes up in the sources as the sort of, well, of course, this is the logical next step. As you say, it was somewhat new at the time. National museums also were, I mean, not as new, but so in a certain way, it was kind of, I don't know, like the going thing that everybody wanted to do. So if we think about kind of the different, like those different regional contexts, the in both cases, the initiatives came from a single collector, who both of whom we've already mentioned, Matthias Berson in Warsaw, Maximilian Goldstein in Lemberg. Both were fundamentally, they were trying to publicize their own collection, to open it to the public. They came from integrated circles. Their family backgrounds were a little different, but the focus of their collections was different. And I do think that that speaks to their different geographies and the influences within them. Goldstein, in addition to fine art, was quite interested in folk art, which really wasn't a focus of Berson's at all. Berson was also much more interested in historical documents that he wanted to display, especially pertaining to Warsaw's Kehillah, the official Jewish community with which his family had a lot of experience. Goldstein also, he envisioned a museum as, when he first calls for a museum. This is in 1910. So the museum doesn't open until 1934, and it in fact opens really without his participation. But there's a whole story in the middle there. But he calls for the creation of a museum. He brings it to the official Kehillah. It doesn't get a lot of traction with them. It's not totally clear why. I think it might partially be personality, which might come out later in the conversation, but he was also he advertises this idea in newspapers, and he was quite interested in this kind of description of what he'll do in expanding his collection, in trading with younger artists who are producing new art on Jewish themes. He wants to trade them something from his collection, something they'll send him. It's unclear to me whether any of these trades ever took place, but that was part of the idea, was fostering young artists. But Berson is a little bit less interested in that. He doesn't seem to want to involve youth in any way. Not that he's opposed to it, but it just never comes up as an option. Berson also, he was a member of the Fine Arts Society in Warsaw, something of an elite institution. Goldstein also had a lot of contacts with elites in sort of the art world, the museum world in Lemberg, but they tended to be people who were really interested in the national minorities or the ethnic groups in the city and in the region. So a lot of his connections are with, let's say, the people at the National Museum in Lemberg, which is a Ukrainian museum. And he writes very positively about its opening in 1910, and later on, people who write about his collection compare it to some of the other collections of Armenians, of Hutsuls, of other ethnic groups not really in Lemberg, but in the region, in Galicia. And I really think that interest in kind of Jews as like one of this pantheon of minority groups absolutely comes out of this Habsburg context from Vienna, but it's also very clear in Lemberg as well. And in Warsaw, we don't as much, it's just not as strong, that idea that Jews are one of many national groups, and that this kind of their ethno-production has value because they're one of these groups. We rather see the idea that Jews are good Poles, which you also see in Lemberg, but it's alongside this idea that Jews are part of this lauded national pantheon, which is also sort of highly esteemed in some of the work that really comes out of the dual monarchy. Some of these kind of encyclopedic works on all of these national minorities in the dual monarchy.
Terrific. So, how would you characterize is the ambition about what is a Jewish museum represent as a public institution? Is it a point of entry to the Polish Jewish past? Is it a foundation for the Polish Jewish future? Something else? What's like their mission statement, if you will, when in
Yeah,
creating these big institutions? It's a lot of work.
yeah. Luckily, a lot of them had mission statements, or at least these kind of founding documents that they need when they incorporate. So that was very helpful in the archives. I think that it's the idea of the past and the future, and the past as an inspiration to the future. A museum would be a testament to a degree of success, and this idea of like this kind of contributionism. Like Jews have contributed so much to Polish culture, to Polish after the war, to Polish independence, depending on who's writing, an inspiration for future generations. Sometimes there's a whiff of like young people don't know what they stand on, not always, but I think there is also this hope of inspiring younger artists, again, in Lviv. But it's never quite made clear how the museum will do this. And I think that it's worth it for us and for people in the audience and people who read the book to think about like your museum experiences would just like look very different from the experiences of people who are visiting these museums. Nowadays, like museum education is a real field. In any larger museum you visit, there's a huge effort to, at least write a narrative on panels on the wall, and often like well beyond that, questions to ponder, contextual essays, all of this, activities for younger visitors. And that's just not the case in museums I'm writing about. I think that possibly museums had a little bit more text than I've been able to locate, but I think the amassment of the objects itself, like the cabinets of curiosities, the Wunderkammern, I think that was supposed to be inspiring and to be self-evident, like their beauty, their bounty, it's self-evident. It's really hard to parse that from written sources. When it comes to when there's a review of an exhibit or a collection, it's always, it's written by an expert or someone who appreciates it, who does have context and background. The guest books that I had access to are all very complimentary and the expert reviews, but it's really tough to say, like, how was there a gap between what the creators envisioned and what visitors experienced? I do write about one critic who he really notes, this is in the 1930s, I would have to double check, but I believe in the 30s. He notes the poor condition of Jewish museums in Poland. He says they weren't visited very much. They had very short opening hours. They had poorly organized collections. And he contrasted that with a new museum in Tel Aviv. And he saw that as a better museum and also as a city with a more vibrant and Jewish life. But others took that sometimes poor condition of the museums in a different way, like historian Meyer Bauerban. He was constantly pushing for more funds to be allocated for museums, more professional curation, better publicity. But by and large, it's a museum experience that I think is unlike what we experience today, for better or worse, probably for better.
Well, yes, museums definitely, when you see the pictures of these old installations,
Yeah.
it's a whole different thing. I want to back up on something you talked about a little earlier about their interest in folk art and in ethnography. And in particular, I was struck by in your book that these Polonized Jews have this very complicated relationship with fellow Polish Jews who were more traditionally observant, were not part of this economic or educated elite, and who are more likely to be Yiddish speakers than Polish speakers. And on the one hand, the Polonized Jews kind of look down at them, on them as they're provincial, they're backward, they're unenlightened. But on the other hand, they consider those Jews the embodiment of a distinctive Jewish culture, and therefore they are the prime suspects for ethnographic study, including from collecting of especially folk material. And in particular, I'm struck by that they tend to look down on Yiddish, but they are avid collectors of Yiddish folk tales and other Yiddish folkways. So what's with that? What do you make of that?
Yeah, these attitudes are interesting. I think part of me feels like this is a question for a psychologist rather than a historian. But I do think that there are a few things going on. And what you say about Yiddish is absolutely right. There's one kind of call for materials that asks for Jews kind of in the provinces, like far away from those urban educated Jews, to send in some materials. And And the call says, you can send material in any language you like, even in Yiddish. Like, what are they going to send materials in Spanish? Like, what are they thinking? But just this real distance that's, on the one hand, that kind of a statement indicates, okay, there are people receiving those materials who actually do read Yiddish. They may say they don't, but they do, or they know people who do. So there's that, but also this very odd rhetorical distancing that I found often very funny. So many of the ethnographers, in terms of ethnographers, qua ethnographers, I'm mainly writing about a group in Warsaw who are mainly using Polish. And they were one generation removed from these quote unquote foreign Jews about whom they wrote. So I think there's this actual closeness, like a sense of kinship. It could be actual kinship that veers into kind of disgust as well as fondness. But that's as far as I'll go with the psychologizing. But I think there's so few ethnographers who really admit to knowing Yiddish or being from the provinces themselves. But one I do write about, Regina Lilientalova, she was an exception. I think she understood that amongst her cohort, there was a little bit of protesting too much, that actually it's not, that you can't denigrate your informants to this degree. The Warsaw Polish language ethnographers, Jewish ethnographers, were really concerned in particular about the so-called Litvak scare, the idea that Lithuanian Jews who had been allowed in Congress Poland since the 1860s, but really arrive in some numbers after 1905, that they're bringing socialism, that they're bringing Zionism, they're bringing all sorts of subversive ideas. The Varsovians are worried that they'll be associated with the Litvaks. Noach Perlutsky, another ethnographer who's not really my focus, he had a lot to say about that. He really excoriated the Warsaw ethnographers who try to distance themselves. And those ethnographers try to position themselves as experts. I think this is really part of it as well. They become indispensable to ethnography, right? They understand the quote unquote backwards Jews, but they're not them. They're educated, they're Polish speaking, they're versed in ethnographic norms from other countries. They're like the perfect go-between. And in some ways that's a posture. It is this kind of protesting too much, but in other ways I think it's true. They are really positioned well for this type of work. I mentioned an ethnographic questionnaire written by a non-Jew, Alexander Świętochowski, who later writes quite nastily about Jews, but at the time of this questionnaire had not gone all the way down that path. But his questionnaire was just ostensibly about Jewish economic life in the countryside. It's entirely about Catholic attitudes towards Jews. It's not about Jews at all, right? So I think that sometimes these Warsaw Jewish, Polish writing, Polish using Jewish ethnographers, I do think to a certain extent they're onto something. They see that they can position themselves in this way. And they're often commenting that there's no research on these Jews in the countryside, that we know more, their audience knows more about, they always say Dahomey, this is their example of a far off exotic place about which we actually know quite a lot, but we don't know anything about the Jews in our backyard, which I don't think is true, but that's a refrain that comes up over and over again.
Yeah. So, you mentioned Litvaks. Meanwhile, you're talking about Warsaw, you're talking about Lvov. How about Vilna? Here we are at the YIVO Institute. We should talk about what you do in the book. Meanwhile, what's going on at YIVO? Their collecting projects, their museum exhibitions. How do they compare? And what do you make of the differences? Are they a matter of ideology, methodology, language preference, where Yiddish is king? So very, very different place, even though they're in some cases collecting and writing about and studying ostensibly the same thing.
Yeah, this is really important, obviously very, very pertinent to our setting today. They are and they aren't different. And I think when I first went into the research, I thought, okay, I had worked on Zommlers before. I had, obviously I had been a fellow at YIVO. I understood, I read a lot about YIVO. I thought I understood quite a lot about YIVO. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to find something totally different. And the way I write about it, it's going to be as a foil. And that's how it's going to be. But I did find that there were quite a lot of similarities, I thought, in the projects they undertook. However, as you say, like the language issue is just fundamentally different, and we can't ever lose sight of that. But in terms of similarities, I think that, first of all, like the use of Zomlers and informants, this is very, very similar to other Polish projects, especially biography, autobiography competitions. This was called the Polish method. So in that regard, it's quite similar. Obviously, all ethnographic projects use informants, but having these Zomlers as these intermediaries is also not unique to YIVO. I was thinking as well about how I mentioned Maximilian Goldstein and Lemberg wanted to correspond with youth. This also has a similar, like, go collect things, bring them back. The YIVO gets a lot more buy-in to using Zomlers and finding these, again, these intermediaries or like a sub-intermediary. That seems like a real innovation. Even though it seems YIVO may have originally intended the questionnaires to be answered directly, the institution of the Zomler really comes out in full force. And that's just kind of, there's a movement aspect to YIVO that the other institutions just don't have as much and don't necessarily want. Like that's not part of what they're interested in. But I would also say that all of the institutions that I talk about, including YIVO, YIVO's museums, as well as some of its other projects, are interested both in self-creation, in fashioning modern Jews, and the museum as kind of a way to help Jews see themselves, and to kind of enter the modern world, especially when we're thinking about the 1920s, which is, of course, when YIVO comes to be, and also to present this image to the public. So there's like a self-fashioning, and then there's a presentation aspect. And I think also the aspect of modernity, the idea that for all of these projects, the collectors, the curators, the Zomlers, they are the intermediaries between the folk and the elite, and they're the ones who have like the proper knowledge to disseminate and illuminate folk ways, artistic ways, etc. The difference is sometimes the content of that presented image, although not always. Quite a lot of what YIVO aimed to do in the museum exhibits that I was looking at is present this modern image. It's modern in Yiddish speaking, not modern in Polish speaking, but other than that, it looks a little bit similar. YIVO's also interested much more in national distinctiveness than the museum. And I think that maybe alongside of Yiddish is the key difference. And that also feels tied to region, tied to a Russian paradigm, the Ansky paradigm, really running with that. Warsaw, of course, is also under Russian control, but it's a completely different political situation from Vilna in terms of influence. And so that's where you do see this real difference. Although there's correspondence, there are people who work both in Warsaw and with YIVO. There's also a huge sense of intercity competition, whose program is the best, whose is the most paradigmatic of Polish Jews, or most exemplary of Polish Jews, who should have, when there's a thought to create a central museum, what city should it be in? Should it be Warsaw? That's the capital. Should it be Lwów? That's they would say the artistic capital, the cultural capital. There's so many museums there. There's a lot of this like intercity competition in the 1920s and 30s that even in the late 30s, like really doesn't die down.
Yes, things keep on keeping on during the up until the start of World War II, and actually even after the war starts, which is quite remarkable. Despite the fact, and I think this is important to talk about, is that during the late 1930s, we start to see this rise of right-wing Polish nationalists. They come to power. And we start to see anti-Jewish actions, economic boycotts, discriminatory quotas in universities, occasional acts of anti-Semitic violence. And so what impact did these developments have, particularly on these Polonized Jews that you focus on, who regarded themselves as, I'm completely Jewish, I'm completely Polish? What is their response when maybe that looks less tenable?
The flip answer to the question is just to say there's no impact, and to leave it like that. there's more to the answer, but it is in large measure true. The developments don't seem to have huge impacts, at least that we can see, again, in terms of how people felt very hard to access, except again through these autobiographies. But in terms of these older, the slightly older generation, most of the museum creators that I am looking at were born in the 1870s, 1880s, so generationally different. Matthias Beerson's older; he was born in the 1820s, but they are an older generation than the generation we see through the autobiography competitions. I think we need to remember that everyone in this story had seen violence against Jews before, especially as part of the First World War. And they saw both in terms of, I mean, really, especially in Galicia, but also thinking about pogroms at the end of the war. And then they see a great deal of hope in the 1920s, even as there's also just this complete political and economic chaos. But by the mid-1920s, I do think there's a sense things are stabilizing. This is a good time, or this is a opportune time. So they do acknowledge what's happening. There are some appeals for fundraising, for example, that use language like, now more than ever. They don't necessarily revisit their whole worldview. Many, I think, do try to keep their options open. This is Ken Moss recently has written, I think, the most about this. The people I'm writing about, by and large, they're a bit older by the 1930s. They're really quite rooted in society. They have professions that you can't necessarily easily move. They have careers, they have families, sometimes a little bit of renown. If they feel anxious about that, it doesn't come out in the sources. And I think that there are all these continued appeals. The museum in Warsaw, Matthias Beerson dies in 1908, and his collection is opened under the auspices of the Kahila to the public in 1910. And there's these sort of like rises and falls. It gets some money, they get some new objects, they get a professional curator, but they don't publish a catalog until I believe it's 1939. And the introduction to that catalog was penned by Regina Lilienthalova earlier about the collection. She had died by that point, but she had worked on the inventory. And then Meyer Balaban also writes about that collection, but it's not published until the late 1930s, and that's mainly, to my mind, about fundraising. And in fact, the introduction to the catalog actually really excoriates the community for not giving them money earlier, which I don't think I've ever seen in a museum catalog ever before, where you kind of say negative things about your donors for not giving more money earlier, but it's a way of doing things, I guess. But we also see in 1937, the Warsaw Kahila gets like a subvention to purchase some new materials, to do a little bit better curation. So I don't know that everyone sees. Obviously they don't know what's coming, but they don't necessarily see what's happening to them as like a slope. But it is that there is this constant push for extra funding and extra expertise, which doesn't strike me as so wildly different from today.
Well, I think a key thing here is we have a perspective they don't have. And this is one of I think the biggest challenges of studying Jewish life in interwar Poland is they don't know it's interwar. And,
yes.
What we see is in the face of challenges, economic challenges and political challenges, that all these groups, not only the folks that you focus on who are, wholly Polish and wholly Jewish, but, the Zionists, the Hasidim, the Bundists, they are doing what they're doing because that's what they believe in. And we need to appreciate that moment for what it is. And it's not easy to do because we know what they don't know. But speaking of what we know that they don't know can you tell us, maybe this will be our last question. So there's all these collections and museums full of materials. What happens to them during and after the war?
Right. So in general, collections in the parts of Poland that were first invaded by Nazi Germany in 1939 were confiscated. Not until 1940, usually. Berson's collection, which was by then housed in a museum where there was also a library, there was also an archive, that was confiscated in 1940. We know about that partially through the writings of Hillel Seidman, who was working as an archivist there. And so he writes about various figures who are connected with, I want to say, the Oriental Institute in Germany. Scholars, Orientalists, they come, they look at the collection, and they eventually confiscate it. Sometimes individuals brought their own private collections or artworks, because there are a lot of private collectors in Warsaw who aren't the subject of the book, but they have smaller collections. Sometimes they bring those to the National Museum in Warsaw, where they appear in various decades later. In areas that were first invaded by the Soviet Union, the situation's a little bit different. First, collections are nationalized, but allowed to stay open. Maximilian Goldstein's personal collection does not become part of the Jewish Community Museum in Lviv for unknown but highly interesting possible reasons. But he's allowed to keep his collection, but he's forced to make it a public museum. Before it was like open by appointment. He's forced by the Soviets to truly open it. I have found a lot less documentation on this period, the 1939 to 1941 period, which is something I'm still always looking for. Some collections were hidden, literally sometimes tucked into other non-Jewish collections. There are a couple of instances, certainly in Lviv, where curators moved the collections from one museum to another after the Nazi invasion, and told functionaries who came to confiscate the collections, oh, those were actually moved yesterday, like you just missed it. This is also the story that's related about the Sarajevo Haggadah, how it's saved, that a curator saved it and told the person who came to get it, the Nazi official, oh, your colleague came to get it yesterday. So the fact that these stories are the same, on the one hand, it's possible. On the other hand, I'm not sure, but that's what we are supposed to believe. In the case of the collections in Lviv, which survived the war, they were often broken apart, displayed in other museum settings. Some end up in the Museum of Atheism, for example. And in general, the provenance research can be a little bit tricky if there's not necessarily pre-war published catalogs for all of these collections. The ones that are published don't necessarily have photographs. So there's still, I think, an effort to find them. There was this collection of ketubas that I mentioned was located, I believe in 2010, around 2010, by somebody working in, I think, the Municipal Art Gallery in Lviv, who was looking through a stack of broadsides or newspapers and came across them and contacted Shalom Sabar, who's an expert on ketubot, and wrote to him, and they figured out that actually this was part of this collection. So things appear still, I mean, to this day, but most of the collections are nationalized, broken apart, etc. And it's unknown, when they're confiscated, especially in Warsaw, it's very unclear to curators, to archivists, where they are going, which I think is how this idea that they must be going to a different museum kind of takes hold. Although, as you've written, there's no real evidence that museum is actually going to be created. But they were definitely taken to Germany. Some end up in Offenbach. Some we're completely not sure.
Well, I think we could go on, but I want to make sure there's time for questions. So, Julia, I'm going to turn the floor back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jeffrey. So we have the Q&A, audience Q&A open. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A function on Zoom. I see we have a bunch of questions already. So Sarah, I want to start with the cover of the book, which is quite striking. I'm just trying to get it closer so everyone can see this object. Can you tell us what this object is and why you chose it as the book cover?
Yes, I chose it as the book cover. There are two versions. One is because a scholar friend saw it and said that has to be the cover of your book, and this was about 8 years ago, and I kept that in mind. But I do think that it is, for me, it's a fantastic image because it is. It's from the collection of Maximilian Goldstein. It is an egg with micrography, so very, very small painting. It is, and it's suspended in a bottle. I'm not sure whether it was always suspended in a bottle or whether that was the artist's intent or not. This egg, this micrographic egg, was one of a couple of similar objects that Goldstein held. They were created by the artist, what's his first name? Jakob Dreysen. So he was a folk artist, but he was known. He's, one of these examples where we actually know the name of the creator. He's also mentioned in other places, like some of the Landkenntnis movement sometimes like mentions him as somebody that they could go visit on a field trip. So he's relatively well known. And to me, this is a wonderful example. If you look closely at the Hebrew writing, and if you are familiar with Hebrew poetry, you will realize that it is Naphtali Hertz Embers, part of the poem. Two stanzas are visible on that egg, and then part of that poem becomes later Israel's national anthem, Hatikva. So it's a kind of Jewish national poem written in Hebrew on an egg. There's obviously a local Polish, Ukrainian, etc. egg decorating tradition. So for me, this is also just a wonderful example of this kind of like syncretic art tradition. It's Polish, it's Jewish, it's pagan, it's Catholic, and it's from Goldstein's collection. It's one of the things that he really admired.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've been curious. This has been sitting on my desk for a few weeks now, and I can't stop looking at it. So thank you. Another question I have is, so the time period that you're examining in this book is a 50-year span, 1891 to 1941. I think a lot of us can perhaps intuit why you stopped at 1941, and why you started 1891, but would you like to tell us, and what was your thinking of using that 50-year span?
Yeah, so 1891 is really where I see these first inklings about Jewish museums in Poland appear. And it happens nicely. I didn't have to do a ton of fudging to make that nice 50-year span. 1941, because this is really the death knell for these museums, which isn't to say that they don't continue on later in other forms. Some of the collections, especially some of the ones I don't write about, actually make it to New York. They find themselves in the Jewish Museum. But 1941 is, and really, I mean, the bulk of the book ends in 1939, just because there's so little material from that Soviet occupying period. But 1941, also 1941, in terms of the people I write about who were still in occupied Poland at that time, 1941, 1942 is when they're murdered. And so that's also kind of the end of this chapter. So yeah.
Great. I see a question in the Q&A about Ansky. You mentioned Ansky very briefly. So where does he fit in? And where does his ethnography fit in to the story that you're telling in the book? And what were the attitudes towards his project?
Yeah, so I think, Ansky appears most obviously in Vilno, with Yivo, thinking about the questionnaires that they use as being actually based on Ansky's questionnaire. They're much more, I mean, Yivo's questionnaires are much more manageable. They're not these 5,000 questions, right? They're thematic. They're not life cycle based, but some of the wording is really directly from Ansky. The museum in Vilnius, there's the Ansky Ethnographic Historical Society. There's a whole correspondence that I relate in the book about this, whether the bust of Ansky is still displayed there. Yes, it is. So I think that Ansky's influence really, really looms large, in his way of conducting ethnography, but also kind of the underlying assumptions of Jews as a distinct national group, that you really see in Vilna, that you really don't see in other places. And when in Warsaw or in Lemberg, Lwów, these museum creators are writing about kind of other museums they want to emulate, they don't look to Vilna, which I find very interesting. They tend to look to sometimes museums in Germany, sometimes in France. They look to Cincinnati, but they don't look to Vilna. And I think some of it is just like that different way of conducting ethnography, the different underlying assumptions.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience about the relationship to displaying religious objects and if there was any tension or consideration of what it meant to display these rather than use them.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. A lot of the objects from that are taken at the end of the First World War are from synagogues that were destroyed in the course of the First World War. And there are a lot of questions about what to do with these objects. Very often, the congregations have moved to cities. Sometimes they've moved abroad. And there are a couple of different thoughts about what to do with these objects. On the one hand, I think that many collectors see them as objects of beauty, as art is in Judaica that can be displayed the same as any other object, and we see a lot of those in the collections. Not all of them are from that First World War period, but many of them. There's also a concern about these objects after the war that they'll be sold abroad. And there is there's a lot of ink spilled about wealthy collectors in Western Europe and sometimes in the United States buying up Poland's heritage. And this is a concern that you see in the general Polish press, not just Jewish, but you see it in the Jewish world as well, that these objects are from here, they belong here, and they're being sold abroad, and that we're losing our cultural riches because we, Polish Jews, can't get it together to build a proper museum. And there's a lot of shame around that as well. And I think this relates also, I think, to some economic tensions. And in terms of the collections, is it improper to display them in a museum? There doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about that. Wouldn't these candlesticks be better used for lighting Shabbos candles, right? There doesn't seem to be a lot of concern about that in the Jewish communities. Amongst some of the non-Jewish boosters of Jewish museums, there is a little bit of attention given to this, saying that Jews will better understand what these objects are, how to use them, and why they're important. So it makes sense that Judaica should be in Jewish museums rather than in national museums, because there was plenty of Judaica in national museums as well, especially in Krakow, which had a subvention grant to purchase it. But there was a thought that, Jews will better know what to do with this.
Great, thank you. Another thing that has been another discussion throughout this conversation has been identity. We've mentioned the youth autobiographies and how the feelings towards of their identity was very different than these collectors. So we have a question in the chat about saying, would you mind explaining what seeing Jews as a distinct national group means? Because this is sort of an undercurrent throughout all of this conversation.
Yeah, I think that in this context, I would say that the question, it's less whether Jews are their own group or a distinct group, but whether that identity is, I guess, how it works with a Polish identity, right? Is it possible that Jews can be good citizens of Poland? And this is a concern that many non-Jewish Poles have, some in a more anti-Semitic way and some in maybe slightly less, but still troubling way. But this is also a question for Jews. To what extent are Jewishness and Polishness compatible? And to what extent are they not compatible? So are Jews distinct from Catholic Poles in ways that maybe feel, at least on the cultural level, not necessarily so significant? or are they so completely distinct as to be thought of as a kind of a foreign group on Polish soil? And there are certainly like the right-wing Polish anti-Semitic camp paints Jews as a totally foreign element, saying that they are Oriental. But there's also a Jewish national element, and it's certainly not, I wouldn't even say it's the majority of Zionist activists, but some will also say, we're not really Polish. This is diaspora. This is different from an inherent Jewishness. So that's what I mean.
Thank you. We have another question. What are the most important lessons that the Polish Jewish Museum experience has for Jewish museums and cultural institutions today? Because we have lots of Jewish museums today, especially internationally and not just in Poland.
It's tough to say drawing lessons. I think because of the end of many of these museums, it's especially hard. But I think that, I was struck by some parallels that I saw. Certainly like the ever-present quest for funding. I would also say the quest for relevance, right? So these museum projects weren't as popular as they thought they would be, and they weren't as popular as they wanted to be. And it turns out that most people don't spend a ton of time going to museums. That may not be true for this audience, but I think it is true in general, that these museums appealed to Jews who understood the project and non-Jews who understood the project, but they didn't necessarily appeal to, like, quote unquote, the masses. So there's some lesson in that. I would be hesitant to say exactly what it is. But also, I think, I was struck thinking with Jeffrey's question about, like, does anything change in these museums in the 1930s? I'm hard pressed to think of a museum that has wholly changed its narrative about, like an American Jewish museum that's wholly changed its narrative after, let's say, the murders in Pittsburgh. Do we change the story of American Jewish life after that? My sense is no. There's discussion, there might be other exhibits, there might be mentions, but that, like, kind of overarching narrative doesn't change. And that seems to be what was happening in Polish Jewish museums at the time as well. And again, that's not a lesson, but it is a parallel that I was really, really struck by.
Thank you. And I think we'll end with one more question, which is, what is your favorite object? There's so much material culture mentioned in this book and so many images as well. Which of these objects were your favorite to research?
This is a great question. I mean, the egg is up there, but one of my favorite objects to research was a lot of the objects I didn't, I wouldn't say that I didn't research them the way that, like, an art historian would research them. But one, I'm just poking through the book because I want to see if it can actually come up on screen, maybe not, but is a collection of breads. And bread is tricky to put in a museum for obvious reasons. But Regina Lilienthalova, the ethnographer, had a collection of decorative breads used for Purim. They're not hamantaschen, they're like stamped breads. Yes, thank you. And she describes these in one of her books, and that picture appears in one of her books. But I wrote to the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow that I think owns the image or owns the collection. And I said, I'd love to get a copy of this for the book. And they said, well, actually, the collection doesn't exist anymore because it was destroyed the bread was destroyed in the course of the First World War. But because Krakow was occupied by German forces in World War I, some German ethnographers, this time in a much less malevolent way, came through the museum and took a bunch of photographs of the collection. So the collection, the photograph that appears in the book is actually was taken probably like 1 year before those objects were actually destroyed. And it's just kind of these like accidents of history that mean that we actually really have this documentation. But this belonged to Regina Lilienthalova, who was very concerned with things made by women and women's role in Jewish life and how she felt that they were shut out of Jewish life. And so that's a very appealing object to me as well. And I've never tried to make a stamped cookie, but maybe one day.
Well, thank you, Professor Zarrow and Chandler, for joining us today. I want to encourage everyone to buy the book or check it out. Displays of Belonging, Polish Jewish Collecting in Museums. I'm sorry, I'm reading backwards. 1891 to 1941, which is available in the Evo store. My colleague Flora just put a link in the chat. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for our first program of our fall 2025 season, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.